Welcome to the Dublin Bible Talks, midweek Bible talks for workers in Dublin. I'm Cameron Jones. If Jesus really is the King of everything, why doesn't he fix things now? 1 Samuel 24 helps us as we see David refuse a shortcut to glory. That points us both to Jesus and to living life as a Christian in a world that can be hostile. And please consider joining us live on Wednesdays from your workplace, 1 p.m. Dublin Time on Zoom. It's a simple way of identifying as a Christian in your workplace. Simply use the link bit.ly/DublinBibleTalks. That's bit.ly/DublinBibleTalks. Well, what's taking so long? I was speaking to those people in the docks the other day, and one of them said, if Jesus really is in charge of everything, why doesn't he fix everything now? Well, that's actually a question that is quite key to these closing chapters of 1 Samuel. David's road to the throne is long and it is hard. It's hard to understand why it's so long and hard. I mean, Saul has been rejected by God. David has been chosen by God. David is the chosen one, and surely God is sovereign. I mean, in the previous chapter, God sent the Philistines at just the right moment to rescue David from Saul. God's in charge, and if God can move armies, why not just hand David the throne immediately? It's the same question that believers still ask today. If God's plan is a new creation without any tears or suffering or pain, why the delay? Why so much suffering now? And we're tempted to push things along ourselves. We start to put our hope in politics and in movements and in charismatic leaders. The desire for change is certainly understandable. The desire for change may even be good, but underneath it lies a deep impatience. We want a shortcut to glory. And you might remember that a shortcut was offered to Jesus. In the wilderness, the devil said, if you are the Son of God, why not seize the kingdom without the cross? Jesus refused. Jesus chose the long road of rejection and suffering. Even after the resurrection, Paul says in 1 Corinthians 15:25 that Jesus must reign until he has put all his enemies under his feet. The kingdom is certain, but it's not yet complete. And that is exactly the same issue we find all the way back in 1 Samuel chapter 24. On this day that we're reading of, David could have just seized the throne, and yet he refused. And in his refusal, we see something about how God brings in his kingdom. And so as we follow the story, we need to keep asking, why does David refuse the shortcut? Which help us to understand, why does Jesus refuse the shortcut? And then help us to understand why we are waiting long road as we're living the life of faith. So we turn to the passage, verses 1 and 2. It opens with Saul back in control. When Saul returned from following the Philistines, he was told, David's up in the wilderness of En-gedi, and Saul took 3,000 men out of all Israel and went to seek David and his men in front of the Wild Goats Rocks. Now that looks impressive. Only a chapter ago, Saul had been forced to break off the chase, but now he's free to resume it with fresh intelligence and a disciplined army still under his command. Notice the scale, 3,000 of Israel's best, hand-picked. And by contrast, remember that David has 600, and they're not elite troops. They are the distressed and the indebted and the embittered, we found out in chapter 22. To humanise the contest is absolutely absurd, 5-1, and a quality against a ragtag bunch of losers. Remind you of anything? Look at Christians. Look what Paul wrote in 1 Corinthians 1 verse 26. Not many of you were wise from a human perspective, not many powerful, not many of noble birth. But here is the irony. Saul chooses his men, but the Lord has already chosen his king. Outwardly, Saul seems stronger, but God's choice is unassailable. This is a clash between human choice and divine choice that we're watching going on here, even if it's taking some time. But isn't that often how life feels to us? I mean, by appearances, God's people, we look outnumbered, we look overwhelmed, we look weak, we look pathetic. The powers against us seem so much stronger, but the truth is the opposite. I mean, human power cannot overturn God's purpose. If God has chosen Christ his king, nothing can change that, even if it looks difficult at the time. Verse 3, we find Saul at David's mercy. There's a twist in that verse. Saul came to the sheepfolds by the way, and there was a cave, and Saul went in to relieve himself. Now David and his men were sitting in the innermost parts of the cave. Of all the caves in En-gedi, Saul steps into this one, alone, no guards, no protection. The king of Israel, with 3,000 troops outside, is suddenly quite literally exposed before the man he's hunting. The detail is quite earthy, it's quite comic. The mighty king is caught with his pants down. But the humour only sharpens the tension of it. Picture it with me. Saul just inside the cave, completely oblivious to David inside the cave with his 600 men crouched in the darkness. If Saul realises they're there and he raises the alarm, well, David's men are finished. But if Saul remains unaware, his own life is right there in David's hands. With all of Saul's power, with his army, his intelligence, none of it matters now as he sits there relieving himself. In one stroke, David, with his sword, could get the kingdom for himself. And this is not luck. This is not coincidence. This is the sovereign hand of the Lord. The God who could send the Philistine raiders at the perfect time in the last chapter, 23 verse 27, can also guide Saul's steps into this very cave where David waits. The God who rules nations rules also over bathroom breaks. Nothing is out of his control. But here's the question. What do you do when the shortcut suddenly falls in front of you? When it looks as if God has handed you exactly what you want, that's the test that David faces in the cave. Will he take the kingdom by his own hand, or will he leave it in God's? Verses 4 to 7, we find Saul spared. In the dark, David's men whisper, "Here is the day of which the Lord said to you, Behold, I will give your enemy into your hand, and you shall do to him as it shall seem good to you." Oh, it's a persuasive argument, isn't it? Saul's the enemy. The Lord's delivered him into his hand. Surely this is the moment. But you might notice that the Lord actually never said this to David. In the last chapter, God had said to David something different. He had said in chapter 23, verse 4, "I will give the Philistines into your hand." David's men are twisting God's word to fit their desire. And isn't that our danger too? To bend Scripture, to justify the shortcut we want? David creeps forward, sword in hand. One thrust and it's over. But instead, verse 4, David arose and stealthily cut off a corner of Saul's robe. Just a corner of cloth, not flesh. And even that, we find in verse 5, fills him with guilt. Afterward, David's heart struck him because he had cut off the corner of Saul's robe. Now, you might ask, why such remorse for doing something so simple? It's because the robe is something that symbolizes kingship in this narrative. You may not remember, but way back in chapter 15, verse 28, years earlier, Saul had torn Samuel's robe. And Samuel had declared to Saul on that day, "The Lord has torn the kingdom of Israel from you this day and has given it to a neighbour of yours who is better than you." By cutting the robe, David has symbolically claimed the throne, and he knows that even that symbolic grasping is going a step too far. And so he says in verse 6, "The Lord forbid that I should do this thing to my Lord, the Lord's anointed, and to put out my hand against him, seeing as he is the Lord's anointed." I mean, Saul might be corrupt, but God removes him. He remains the king God appointed until then. And David will not seize what God has not given. The text continues in verse 7, "So David persuaded his men with these words and did not permit them to attack Saul. And Saul rose up and left the cave and went on his way." The word persuaded there is quite a mild translation. David tore into his men with his words. He restrained them fiercely because to them, what David had done had looked like madness. But David needs to correct them harshly. And friends, isn't it true that faith often does look like madness? The world in which we live says, take control, don't wait. Even fellow believers may be encouraging shortcuts. This wing of politics is the way to make the world Christian. But David shows the truth. The kingdom is not ours to grab, it is God's to give. And in the darkness of that cave, David foreshadows the obedience of Christ, who refused the crown before the cross, who himself waited for God's hand. In verses 8 to 15, we find something about David's innocence and grace. Saul leaves the cave. He's still completely unsuspecting. He hasn't noticed that the corner of his robe has been cut off. He hasn't known the danger he was in. And then David does something astonishing. After Saul steps away, David steps out into the open. Verse 8, "Afterward David also arose and went out of the cave and called after Saul, 'My lord the king.' And when Saul looked behind him, David bowed with his face to the earth and paid homage." I mean, imagine that scene. Saul's going down the slope, his troops are nearby, and David, with nothing behind him but a cave, nothing behind him apart from what would be a trap to be slaughtered in, utterly exposed, David bows down in the dust, and he honours the king who's been trying to kill him. And when he speaks, verse 9, "Why do you listen to the words of men who say, 'Behold, David seeks your harm'? Behold, this day your eyes have seen how the Lord gave you today into my hand in the cave. And some told me to kill you, but I spared you. I said, I will not put out my hand against my Lord, for he is the Lord's anointed." David dismantles the lie. Saul has been claiming David is a traitor, but the evidence proves otherwise. Verse 11, "See, my father, see the corner of your robe in my hand. For by the fact that I cut off the corner of your robe and did not kill you, you may know and see that there is no wrong or treason in my hands. I have not sinned against you, though you hunt my life to take it." That scrap of robe is David's proof. David could have killed him, but he showed mercy. And so in verse 12, he appeals, "May the Lord judge between you and me. May the Lord avenge me against you, but my hand shall not be against you." Judgment belongs to God, not to David. And he presses the point with a proverb in verse 13, as the proverb of the ancient says, "Out of the wicked comes wickedness, but my hand shall not be against you." If David were wicked, he would have done the wicked thing. Instead, he spares the man who is his enemy. And then he adds with some irony in verse 14, "After whom has the king of Israel come out? After whom do you pursue? After a dead dog? After a flea?" All Saul's might is wasted chasing someone who's no threat to him. who has demonstrated that he will not lead a revolution, who has proved that he will not seize the throne. And finally, David entrusts everything to God. May the Lord, therefore, be judge and give sentence between me and you, and see to it and plead my cause and deliver me from my hand. Friends, that is remarkable. David, hunted and wronged, refuses to pay back evil with evil, and instead entrusts himself to the Lord. And maybe those of us who have been Christians for a while will hear an echo of this into the New Testament, as Peter wrote about Jesus, that he committed no sin, neither was deceit found in his mouth. When he was reviled, he did not revile in return. When he suffered, he did not threaten, but continued entrusting himself to him who judges justly. In this account, David is foreshadowing Jesus Christ, who perfectly embodies patience and grace. And also for us, there's a lesson. When wronged, isn't our instinct to strike back? But the way of the kingdom is different, isn't it? We turn the other cheek. We entrust ourselves to God's justice, and in the meantime we show mercy. We wait for his vindication. We do not take it for ourselves. In verses 16 to 22, we find Saul's confession and a plea. David finishes his speaking. Humanly, he's still in grave danger, isn't he? Saul has only to call, and 3,000 soldiers will strike. But instead, something unexpected happens. In verse 16, as soon as David had finished speaking these words, Saul said, "Is that your voice, my son David?" And Saul lifted up his voice and wept. This king who had hurled spears, this king who had shed innocent blood, now breaks down in tears. He even calls David my son. For a moment, the hostility melts away. And then we get a confession in verse 17. "You," says Saul, "are more righteous than I. For you, David, have repaid me good, whereas I have repaid you evil. And you have declared this day how you have dealt well with me, in that you did not kill me when the Lord put me into your hands. For if a man finds his enemy, will he let him go away safe? So may the Lord reward you with good for what you have done to me this day." Even Saul cannot deny the truth that has been presented to him. David had power, but he chose mercy, and in that his righteousness is undeniable. He acted correctly in terms of the relationship between him and Saul. And now comes the climax, verse 20. "And now behold, I know that you shall surely be king, and that the kingdom of Israel shall be established in your hand." After years of resistance, Saul admits what God had decreed all along. In his own lips, he confirms it. The kingdom is David's. God's choice cannot be overturned. All Saul can do now is plead. Verse 21, "Swear to me, therefore, by the Lord, that you will not cut off my offspring after me, and that you will not destroy my name out of my father's house." The hunter starts to beg. The king begs mercy from the fugitive he is chasing. And David does swear. I mean, he's already promised that to Jonathan in chapter 20, verse 15, but he now promises it to Saul too. And here the story ends in verse 22, "And Saul went home, but David and his men went up to the stronghold." Saul's tears are real, but it seems that they are fleeting. David knows better than to trust those tears, and it seems the conflict isn't over. And yet the point is clear. The point of the passage is quite strong. Saul is not undone by violence. He is not undone by David taking opportunity to kill him. Saul is undone by mercy. His confession is forced out, not by a sword, but by righteous behaviour. And here again, David points us to Jesus Christ, for at the cross, Jesus conquers not by seizing power, but by laying it down, by laying down his very life. It is the mercy of Christ that has disarmed the enemies. It is the righteousness of Christ that establishes his kingdom. And that is how God's kingdom still advances, not by shortcuts, not by force, not by politics, but by the way and the word of the cross. The story in the cave is not mainly about David's self-control. It's not even about our need to copy him. It's a story about God's kingdom and about God's way of bringing it in. Verse 20, the kingdom of Israel shall be established in your hand, but not by David's grasping, only by God's gift. That is why David refused the shortcut. He would not seize what only God could give. And that is why Jesus too refused the shortcut. In the wilderness, the devil offered him glory without the cross. On Calvary, the crowd shouted, "If you are the Son of God, come down from the cross and save yourself." But Jesus chose to entrust himself to his Father. And through that obedience, through that righteousness, the kingdom has been established forever. And that is the gospel truth for us today. The kingdom does not rest on our strength or on our cleverness or on our ability to grab opportunities. It rests on Christ, the true anointed one, who has already secured the victory. And as we conduct our ministry as Christian people, as we seek to tell people the gospel of Jesus Christ, we do it with urgent patience. Urgent because the time is short. Christ is coming soon. But patience because we know it is the Lord's work by his word, not ours. Our work is to speak, and even to make it strong and convincing in our argument. But we cannot convert anyone. No, it is the Lord's work, not ours. And so we will speak the gospel when we have the opportunity and be patient, letting God do his work by his word and by his Spirit. So yes, this passage calls us to patience, and it calls us to trust God's timing. But even more, it calls us to great confidence. Confidence that God is so sovereign, that Christ does reign, and that the kingdom will come, and it won't come by human grasping. It'll come instead by the gracious hand of God himself. And that leads radically to different behaviour as Christians in a hostile world. Like in 1 Peter, we read, "Beloved, I urge you as sojourners, as wanderers and exiles, to abstain from the passions of the flesh which war against your soul. Keep your conduct among the Gentiles honourable, so that when they speak against you as evildoers, they may see your good deeds and glorify God on the day of visitation. Be subject, for the Lord's sake, to every human institution, whether it be to the emperor as supreme, or to governors as set by him to punish those who do evil and praise those who do good. For this is the will of God, that by doing good you should put to silence the ignorance of foolish people. Live as people who are free, not using your freedom as a cover-up for evil, but living as servants of God. Honour everyone, love the brotherhood, fear God, honour the emperor." Friends, how do you see how different, do you see through this how different God's kingdom is from the world's way of thinking? In the workplace and in the world at large, leaders are admired for being forceful and ambitious and ruthless. Advancement comes from pushing ahead, seizing opportunity, cutting corners. But here we see something utterly different. David refuses to take the kingdom by force. Jesus refuses the shortcut to glory. God's kingdom is not grasped but given. And that changes how we live. Most of us spend our lives at work where results and performance and image seem to be the things that matters most. But if we belong to Christ, our security does not rest on what we can achieve. It rests on what God has already given us in Christ. That frees us to work with integrity, with patience, with diligence, not scrambling to secure ourselves, but working for God's glory. And here's a striking thing. Saul himself was forced to admit David's righteousness. In the same way, our colleagues may be confronted by patient faith, by our constant honesty, by our grace. When we refuse shortcuts, when we do not retaliate when we are insulted, when we quietly serve with integrity even when we're not being watched, when we will obey our boss even though they are not being pleasant to us, they may see that we live under a different king. And that may open the very door that we want to speak of Jesus, the Son of David, who entrusted himself to his Father, and who now reigns forever. Thank you for listening to the recording of the Dublin Bible Talks. You can join us in real time on Wednesdays at 1 p.m. Dublin Time on Zoom, bit.ly/DublinBibleTalks. That's bit.ly/DublinBibleTalks.